welcome to this episode of Tea Time Talks with MDRP. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that's very important from the conformity perspective of medical device regulations. We're talking about essential requirements and the transition from essential requirements to general safety and performance requirements, which we also call GSPRs. We are going to go back to the basics and beyond it to understand how these requirements apply to medical devices and the manufacturers who are required to address conformity to these requirements. In order to have the discussion today, I have with me Gert, who is an expert in the field, and he needs no introduction. But just for you listeners, I'll ask him to provide a little bit of background on his experience. Welcome to the show, Gert, and let's hear from you a little bit about your experience.
So hello, Anushri. It's a pleasure to be with you and join your members for this interesting topic. Giving my background, of course, you can all read that on LinkedIn and other profiles and so on and so on. But in essence, I'm an engineer from background. I worked a few years in the pharmaceutical field, development of controlled release of drugs, gene therapy, and vaccination. And the speed at which that develops didn't match my temperament, I understood after a few years. So I switched to medical devices, which is a little bit more hands-on. And after 15 years in notified body work, in various notified bodies in DECRA in the Netherlands, in BSI in the UK, I have found myself since 5 years working as a consultant on strategic levels. During the time I worked for notified bodies, I have been basically speaking on behalf of all notified bodies in my roles as chairman of the notified body fora in relation to the build-up and the negotiations for the MDR and the IVDR. So lots of content basically for various ways from the notified body perception, which of course is logical because ultimately, as we see, notified bodies have an essential role in the interpretation between the more vague wording in the law and the practical documentation that a manufacturer is providing. So forming the bridge, that has been very helpful in building a doable, workable MDR, and especially also Annex 1 on the GSPRs. That is pretty technical. So in that sense, it's quite easy for manufacturers to understand what they need to do, provided they understand the concepts behind the medical device regulation.
Right, absolutely, good. I agree with you that when it comes to these regulations, there's a lot about interpretation of regulations, and you are somebody who's coming from the notified body perspective as well. And I think, like you said, the bridging of that gap from what the notified body requires and how the manufacturers are interpreting, that's very important. And I see that your experience is going to be very, very important and valuable in the discussion that we're about to have. So once again, welcome to the show, and I'm really excited to take this forward. All right, folks. So as always, before we dive into the questions, there is an introductory session on what we're discussing. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about essential requirements and general safety and performance requirements. So essential requirements come from the Medical Device Directive, MDD, that were in effect before MDR came into the picture. But there is, of course, a lot of the lessons and learnings that we take forward as we transition into the MDR aspect of medical devices. MDRs provide general safety and performance requirements, which are essentially similar to what we have in ERs. And of course, there are some differences that we'll be discussing with Gert today. To sum it up, these regulations provide requirements which every medical device is required to fulfill in order to establish conformity with the regulations themselves. Conformity assessment becomes a crucial aspect of clinical evaluation of devices, and every device manufacturer is required to ensure that the medical device adheres to these requirements. In the MDD, or the Medical Device Directive, there were 13 essential requirements, and there were separate 16 requirements for active implantable medical devices in the AI-MDD. Now in the MDR, we have 23 SPRs, or safety and performance requirements. These 23 SPRs not only bring together AI-MDD and MDD-ERs into a single document, but they also provide some more logical separation of different topics from the previously combined requirements. So, diving right into the question, Gert. So, like I said, we know that there are 23 GSPRs as compared to 13 ERs in the MDD and 16 in the AI MDD. I want you to throw a little bit more light upon what are the key changes that manufacturers should prepare for and should be implementing in order to have this transition done in a better way.
Well, that's a very open and broad question. And let me start by saying, well, let's first focus on what is the same, and then we dive into what are some of the key changes. And to say first, well, one of the key things that didn't change is the structure and the order of appearance of the requirements. And so they're put into three sections. First, a general section, which is basically about the key requirements from a legislative perspective. Then the second part is more hands-on. It deals with the expectations in validation, basically, and how to design and validate the product on a more technical level. And then the third part is what should you put on the labeling and the IFU. And so the structure is the same as it was for MDD and AIMD. Now, if we look into a little bit more detail in each of these three sections, we can see the following. If we start from the first, these are 9 now in the MDR, 9 GSPRs, number 1 to 9, we can see that they focus largely on risk management as it is linked to the clinical benefits. And of course, we remember from MDD and AMD that the ultimate goal of the legislation was to find a positive risk-benefit ratio. And that concept is still the same. But what has changed is a few things in that part. We do see that there's much more specification on what you need to document and how you need to document your risks as well as your benefits. Risks need to follow a process approach, a quality system-based approach, where a lot of details need to be identified, and ultimately all the residual risks that you cannot mitigate any further. And one of the changes is that you need to mitigate as far as possible. But once that you cannot mitigate further, you will have to add as a warning on the labeling, on the IFU. Second part that is changing is on the clinical benefit part. Clinical benefit now has to be much more precise. So the indications have to be detailed with more precision throughout the technical documentation. And so basically the challenge for manufacturers will be to match up for each hazard, for each risk, and for each clinical benefit, how they align so that the risk benefit is not in general for the device, but the risk benefit can be stated for each risk and for each benefit, and ultimately, of course, for the entire product itself. One final change there is that the GSPR 1 is also talking about the word effective. And so product doesn't only have to be safe and perform as intended, as we know from the old directives, but it also has to do something. So you have to, so it says basically that your claim must be a medical claim. So it is useful for the patient in order to progress their disease state or to help them recover. So it has to be effective, and that has to be part of the claims. And that is an essential change. If we look at, maybe we can skip first onto the final section, which is the labeling and the information. We do see that that hasn't changed much, although it looks horribly different. It looks horribly different because it is 3 times more bullet points that you need to address in your information, in your manuals, as well as on your label. But if you look down to what exactly now is required, it is not much more than it was before. We already talked a little bit about these warnings and precautions that come from the early GSPR, so your final risks that are still there when the patient is using the device. So that effectively is a new element. And there will be some technical details that we can dive into in a few minutes later. that also then require, in some cases, new symbols, like a symbol on UDI, on use of human or animal tissue, and so on. And they will be hopefully soon provided in the new version of a standard, a harmonized standard. Um, what actually is the main change are two things, and that has to do with the transparency. That is one of the overarching elements of the regulatory change. The MDR wants the user and also other interested parties, journalists and whoever, to have more access and knowledge and understanding of the product, including its performance and its risks. And therefore, it has two different requirements in this GSPR 23. One is the readability, and that exactly is for the user. So the user, and you have to do layperson and user testing with that, they should exactly understand what the product is, what the risks are, and how they should handle the product correctly. Second part is not only for the user, but also for anyone with another interest. And that is that the information that is in the IFU and in the further labeling has to be on the website of the manufacturer. Unless the manufacturer has no website, but I am still to find the first manufacturer that doesn't have a website. So that doesn't mean that the label has to be and the IFU has to be on the website, but the core information that is in there has to be in a version controlled way on the website. If we move to the middle part is more technical in nature, and so that is the GSPR 10 to 22. Some of them are actually new, and others are more detailed than they were before. So I would say we can go through some of these elements in a little bit more detail, but that is where the key change on the validation, on the technical documentation lies. So the first part is where the conceptual changes are. What do we accept as risk? How much benefit do we want to see? That ties into your clinical evaluation. The last part is about how do you display that in your IFU and on the labels. And the middle part is where the actual changes are. And so if you allow me, Anushree, we can go through some of these with a little bit more detail so that the listener can start to understand what in essence the technical new requirements are.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Right, and so then on a higher level, to first summarize what is actually new, and then we'll go through the core changes. Some of the elements are related to the broadening of the scope of the MDR. And so it includes now also non-medical devices under Annex 16. So some elements in the GSPRs are related to that, for instance, GSPR 9. In some cases, you'd have to see, well, if these are cosmetic implants or non-medical cosmetic implants, you still have to try to meet all the technical requirements unless they do not make sense. And so from GSPR 10 to 22, basically that section is where you, for each product, can identify which ones are applicable, which ones are not applicable, or which ones are partially applicable. And so for these non-medical devices, sometimes they will be partially applicable because not all the benefits you can demonstrate. Then in line with the concepts that are basically global, we focus on more and more reduction of hazardous substances, of toxic material and so on. So some of the changes, and we'll dive into some detail after this general overview, that will be changing. That will be a lot of work to investigate actually what the toxicity levels of your current products that you already put in the market are. Then, of course, with the progress of the developments that we have seen since the MDD, of course, we didn't even have mobile phones in the time. They didn't exist. We didn't have laptops. And so by now, everything is programmable. Everything is connected. And so, of course, there are some requirements, and I'm actually glad that it's only a few line items about what you have to do. on electronic programmable systems that are now at the heart of most of the devices that we see. And that stems from the IFVD legislation, basically, where there has historically been a differentiation between who is the user. Is that a medical professional or is that a lay person? And so that concept of lay persons, and they should be addressed in a different way, and validation should be different, comes now to the medical device legislation as well. And overall, in most of the others, we do see that it is more detail as required. And so let's focus on a few things where more detail or a different concept is what we see. And the first is on the chemicals, toxicity, and basically also biocompatibility properties. And that aligns also with the new edition of the biocompatibility standard that has just been released, where basically the new thinking and expectation from notified bodies in line with the new standard as well is that what we've always done is not good enough anymore. So what we've done in the past is we used Annex 1 of this standard, or Part 1, which is a table basically indicating which test do you have to do depending on the level of invasiveness and the length of interaction between a medical device and the patient. And that determines basically your program. What is now new is that notified bodies would say, well, that is just an example. For each product, you have to justify what your matrix is. And so you cannot just say, oh, I'm doing what is in the standard, that is good enough. No, it's more, you have to do the thinking and the justification to defend yourself that what you do is sufficient to meet the requirements. If we then look at the rest of the chemical and toxicity elements, then there's basically two elements of key change. First is that we're much more specific into the CMR, into the endocrine disruptors as well. So carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic materials, you have to analyze what's in your production as well as in your final product. Have to make some calculation as to what is then the amount of material that will be exposed to the patient, but also from a patient perspective, if they with a certain disease are experiencing a number of treatments, a number of contacts with different devices, you also have in your risk management to start looking at the total burden of these toxic materials to the patient given the conditions that they have. And then there are some ranges as to what the maximum thresholds are. And the same is for endocrine disruptors. And in most of my talks, I get questions like, what is that? And so basically an endocrine disruptors is a chemical that changes and interacts with your endocrine system. It changes your reproductive, neurological, and immune system, both in humans as well as in wildlife. And so that also can have a secondary effect because some medical devices would utilize animal material. And so some of the endocrine disruptors would come from that sourcing of animal materials. But usually we would say, well, these are polychlorinated biphenyls and products like that. Dioxin, which you hear a lot about also in the food industry, estrogens, and so on. So in that sense, well-known chemicals in that sense for the CMR, there is a list in legislation 1272 from 2008 that's being updated on a regular basis. So for that, we have clear guidance in Europe. You can look at the chemical safety agents and food safety agents for these levels and what is accepted as CMR and what is not accepted. For endocrine disruptors, it's more complex because there is no general list of which products we in Europe would anticipate to be covered in that sense. Either way, lots of detail that you will have to investigate, getting information from your suppliers. Sometimes that's difficult because they say it's proprietary information. They refuse to give you that. Otherwise, they might only give you ranges or limits and not exact details, again, to protect their intellectual property. But in some cases, you might actually get the real data also on your bill of materials. if you do not have sufficient materials, it means you will have to do chemical testing. And what we've seen in last year and a half, is that many manufacturers that prepared early for the MDR had reserved a lot of money for doing clinical testing. What they have done is they have refunded some of that money and some of that reservation in their budget to do toxicity analysis and additional biocompatibility testing. So that truly is, and I realize I'm spending quite some time on this, but this is one of the unexpected changes, basically, because the level of detail and the expectation from notified body is much more than most people have originally anticipated. So be warned and make sure that GSPR 10 is on your radar. If we move to 11, which is on infection and microbial control, there's not a big change with the, well, the wording is slightly changed. And so this change, generic change, is that risk that is identified has to be reduced as far as possible. That is not in the current standard, that is not the current expectation under MDD, nor globally, where there is some kind of balance between the effort to reduce risks further and the cost associated and return on investment. And so that basically is changed. So it now, wording in the law is as far as possible. And that is a very difficult one, because in many cases you cannot go any further because it will be ridiculous, the type of risk measures and safety valves that you have to add to your devices, and nobody will want to use your device anymore. So there is a kind of a balance, but it is much harder to defend. Now, specifically for microbial contamination and infection, you have to focus your risk management much more on unintended cuts. So if there are sharp objects and so on, that needs a lot of attention. Second part is the microbial leakages, and with that also contamination has much more prominent place. And the last element of that is the packaging integration. So final packaging as well as intermediate packaging, validation thereof, it was never looked at in much detail. There's not even European standards. And we all had to apply American standards from AMI. That will now feature much more prominently. And probably that means also that there might be a shift, a push towards getting these standards to a more recognized ISO level moving forward. The GSPR 12, substances of degradation absorbed locally, that is a difficult one. That is creams and all kinds of other moisturizers and so on. Many of them historically wouldn't be seen as medical devices. They were sold as cosmetics. They were over-the-counter products. Then that legislation changed. And so many manufacturers decided to claim that these were class 1 medical devices. But there is no medical function. And if there is a medical function, it might be even more pharmaceutical than physical. And so to remove a lot of these products from the market, rather than having a big market oversight action, they have decided to add GSPR 12, which basically says that if your product is a cream or a moisturizer or anything like that, which is partially absorbed and dispersed into the body, into the skin, for instance, to have its local effect, you need to get an approval also from the pharmaceutical agency, not for the drug functioning, because it's not a drug, but for all other aspects that normally a drug agency would be looking at in terms of safety and performance. And that has led to the majority of these products no longer wanting to be a medical device and effectively being either moved from the market or moved into a general safety product rather than a medical device. One more that is aligned with that as well is basically on materials of biological origin, human origin, animal origin. Nothing truly changes in the expectations in what you have to deliver in your validation, but there will be some additional symbols that you have to put on the label And again, you have to declare, and we start seeing that in different regions as well. In Middle East, some countries are also asking, please always put in what type of animal tissue or human tissue is being used, even if historically, for instance, for the underlying CE marking, that wouldn't have to be done. And so we see that the MDR is picking that up as well. If we focus a bit more on further changes, we do see, for example, in the safety and performance requirements 14 and 16, some general improvements that will I guess will be easy to follow, but it's details that we've never had to disclose before. And so that is, for instance, on maintenance requirements, on disposal of products after they have been used and so on. So most manufacturers will have that information, so it's not an additional requirement, but the fact that you have to put it in your documentation as well as in your IFU, that is new. Then move to something new. Well, I guess in some of the questions later we come back to software. So let's skip the software for now. But then after that, following on the software, there are other elements in the new GSPRs that relate to cybersecurity. So not necessarily to the product being software or utilizing software, but with that comes the whole cybersecurity suite with all the specific requirements. And of course, in Europe, that is also supported by some specific regulatory requirements, not in the MDR, but on cybersecurity, as well as on the data protection, so the GDPR, where the legislation aligns with the 10 points of attention that typically are required in making sure that both the data is secured from a privacy perspective as well as from a safety perspective. So GDPR is on the privacy, cybersecurity is on making sure nobody messes with the devices or hijacks the data from the hospital, in line with legislative requirements in these fields, I would say everywhere in the world. GSPR 19, we're getting closer to the end of this section. 19 basically is a summary of all the things you would have to do for active implants on top of the basic MDR requirements. So it's just a copy paste from the leftovers from the AIMDD to make sure that the integration of the two legislative frameworks is in place. And why is Europe integrating this? Actually to correct a mistake from the past. So we all know that the Active Implantable Directive was the first one published, and then we got the MDD. And many people have asked, so why not put that in one directive in the first place? And that is because originally they wanted to publish like 10 or 20 directives, one on active implants, then one on orthopedic implants, and one on cardiovascular implants, and so on. And they saw that the process was so complex and lengthy that they came up with a clever plan with the classification systems and so on, and put them all into one legislation. So that's where we're now moving the MDR to include also the AIMD, so that we move forward as originally scheduled. Mechanical and thermal risks in GSPR 20 are very similar what they were before, but there's a little bit more focus on errors, user errors, and I would say that's also the case, for an example, for the GSPR 22. I mentioned that before. This is on the lay persons. And also there, the focus is on, do we know that based on what we provide, the device, how intuitive the device is designed, with the clarification of symbols and labeling and so on, is that always foolproof? Do users know what to do and what not to do? And that is especially important because also we have an additional article which basically puts you as a manufacturer into a position that you have to prevent off-label use and wrong use. And if you let that go, then basically that would be an offense. And so therefore, there's also in this GSPR much more focus on you being able to demonstrate that you've done what you can to ensure that people use the devices in accordance with the instructions and the claims that go with it. And I guess that's the more detailed rundown of the validation and technical issues that are changing. Lots on software, but we'll come back to that as well, Anushree, and then lots on the toxicity biocompatibility. The rest is more administrative in nature if I have to classify it in one way or another.
Right. Great. That was an exhaustive summary of what are the key changes, what are the new things that manufacturers should keep an eye out. And I think you've covered pretty much everything, the entire ground. Like I said, we'll come back to the software bit. But before we go on to that, a couple of questions or additional perspectives that I'm looking for. When you said that there's a lot of biocompatibility and toxicity analysis requirements that are now present in the GSPRs, so, are all medical device manufacturers, those who have the devices in the market also, they are going to be required to perform these additional toxicity analysis for their devices? Is that correct?
That actually is a very good precision of what I've said. That is not correct, but well, everyone has to consider if they have to do it. So it's a requirement where, as I mentioned, you can argue that it is not applicable. But it is not applicable only if the product doesn't touch anyone. And so in this case, you have to start looking at, well, what is the interaction between my product or parts of the product with the patient and or the user? So also buttons and knobs and so on that the hospital staff would be using, the doctor, the nurses, and so on, they are part of the assessment as well. If you have very large equipment, but only a small area is touching the patient or the user, then the calculations and the knowledge base that you're validating can focus on that part. If it is more conceptual, that your product is yeah, maybe the outside is touching the patients, but the whole product is going into the patients, like a heart valve or a pacemaker or something, then you could say, well, let's focus on the outside material to keep the toxicity of the leachables and so on as low as possible. But then typically also because you don't know what will happen, especially if there will be leachables, if there will be problems, it's taken as the total material of everything basically that's included. So it depends. If you have software only, of course, there is no material touching anyone. And so then toxicity biocompatibility is not applicable. And so similar as it was before with biocompatibility, you can argue your way out, but it has become more difficult than it was before. Typically in the past, it was when you have an implant or something really touching the patient for longer than a few seconds, that's where you had to do the testing. And now it's more black and white. If it touches anyone, you have to do the testing.
All right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, and like you said, Gert, that manufacturers are now, of course, required to provide more detailed information about their products, and it is in the interest of the end users, or rather the patients, who are going to be able to understand what effect these devices have on their bodies. And in a way, that's good. But for manufacturers, of course, like you said, that this is added documentation and a lot of detailed information. And you specifically spoke about efforts to reduce or prevent off label usage of the device. Now, here I'm thinking that coming from a scientific background myself, I know that sometimes it is required that you want to see how a device would function. Suppose a device that is indicated for cerebral procedures, and sometimes physicians use it for coronary procedures because they're familiar with the device and they believe, based on their expertise, they believe that they are going to be able to carry out a successful procedure, probably in the case of a rare disease, and they feel that this is humanitarian usage of the device. So when something like this happens and there is a publication that says that this was successfully done also, or will the onus of this off-label usage fall on the manufacturer then too? Uh, I mean, because if I understand correctly, when you say that they should be able to show that they have tried as much as possible, that translates into providing adequate warning and indication, contraindication information on device labeling. But beyond that, what can manufacturers do to achieve something like this?
Yeah, so that depends a little bit on the situation. And so, of course, when you say it's a surgeon that makes a decision to use something off label, they are protected by different laws. They have to treat the patients, they have to save lives, and they basically can do what is needed to protect that patient. So, if it's a one time use or whatever, that will not be an issue. It's more that manufacturers need to find out if off label use is more structural or if they're even their salespeople are promoting it. So if that is happening, well, one of the things that you can check as a manufacturer is who do I sell it to, and if their sales are being bumped and it is to a hospital that only does the cardiac procedures, and you're not allowing it for cardiac procedures in your IFU, then you have kind of an issue. Or if you know you sell to a distributor that is well known for distributing to the patients directly using pharmacies and so on, but not to hospitals, and your product is for hospital professional use only, then there's a mismatch as well. Or if you see a lot of literature talking about all the benefits and all the possibilities of your devices that are off-label, you have to investigate as well. So part of your post-market program is to make sure that what you've carefully put in your GSPRs, in your validation document, is what people have adhered to. Now, the occasional off-label use, it might inspire you to investigate and to see if there is enough data, or if you can, with additional data, clinical data, performance data, to expand your claim. In other cases, you would just leave it as a one-time off-label use. That can happen, but you should be more aware than before. And in cases where it's warranted, and that's the gray zone, when do you have to do something? But that is where you have to start taking actions. So whatever you've claimed, whatever you've validated in your GSPRs, that is much more precise what the notified bodies have certified. And then if you stimulate off-label use, or if you start clinical trials to investigate off-label use, that basically is seen as a pre-CE study and pre-CE validation. So basically anything that you do to work further on expanding the claims and so on is as if you're not having a CE mark. If you look at it that way, then you're good to go.
All right, that clarifies it a lot actually. Thank you so much, Gert. And I think we've covered a lot of ground on what are some key changes, and we can move on to the next questions that are more specific. So, talking about device manufacturers who have demonstrated compliance to MDD, how would a change to GSPRs be initiated? And I know that you've already spoken a little bit about this in the previous question also. So, just to sum it up, as a device manufacturer, if I'm thinking about showing conformity to GSPRs, what are some of the changes and how I'm going to initiate the overall process?
And so let's focus most on that last part of the question, like how do you do this? Where do you start? And we've seen manufacturers early on trying to upgrade their essential requirement checklist to what's now required. That is much more difficult than those that have started from scratch. And so basically what we've seen manufacturers do also for legacy devices, also then for those that have already passed through MDR certification, the majority have said, okay, let's start from the new GSPR, create a new list similar to what we previously many companies did for essential requirement checklists. Sometimes even notified bodies would have provided that in the past. And so you have a table listing the requirements, whether it is applicable or not. If not applicable, then that field doesn't only say that, but there's now a justification, a few sentences why it is not applicable. Then the third column would be the method, like what have you done And in the beginning, you can also use that as kind of a gap assessment. What have we done in the past, but what do we still need to do in case there are gaps to ensure we have the right justification or test with the validation or test with the verification. Then the fourth column would be to reference basically if a harmonized standard can be used. Well, at this moment, we don't have any harmonized standard. The good news is that the attempt to get harmonized standard has last month again been initiated, but it will be a few years before we start seeing a large number of harmonized standards. In that fourth column, we will also make reference if there's a common specification, which is a new tool from the legislator in Europe to write kind of product specific or technology specific expectations on top or beside standards. Or, and that is where you have to start, other solutions. And so other solutions in this case would mean going back to standards that you have used in the past. Why did you use them? They were harmonized for MDD or AIMD. That is not enough anymore, but you might still argue that this is kind of state of the art on that technical requirement. But again, you have to justify why that is good enough. And then the last column would be, as it was before, the evidence. Where can the reviewer find the validation documents and so on? But it is not enough to refer what many did before. Well, this is in the risk management plan, or this is in the biocompatibility file. It has to be very precise to an individual document, sometimes even chapter or page number of the document. Because now also notified bodies are using a similar checklist. They go through every line. They need to set their marks like, yes, I've seen it, I've confirmed that they have the right information or justification. So the easier you make it for them to find the information, the smoother your ride into MDR will be. So starting from scratch, but then backfilling with some of the validations you've done before is a good approach. And then on the validation documents, similar to what we've all know from, say, sterilization validation, validation of your manufacturing plant, there are moments in time that you have to go back and revalidate, either partially or fully, have a new EQ, PQ for new equipment, and so on and so on. With that same intention, you have to also go back to other validation documents that you have from your design, from the toxicity, from biocompatibility, and so on. And if it's older than a few years, you have to ask yourself, is it still state of art? Or should I repeat all or some of the testing in order to be able to convince the notified body?
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And like always, when we talk about this transition, exhaustive gap assessment is critical to starting any sort of bridges that you're building to make sure that you're bringing your devices adequately into the MDR space. So here also, I think manufacturers have to go through each requirement, and based on the devices that they have to perform this gap analysis and then determine what exactly that they need to do based on what you said. So yes, that makes a
Yeah, but
lot of sense.
there's one warning on that. Exhaustive gap assessments, yes, but at a high enough level. So if you're building this GSPR checklist basically as a gap assessment, that is fine. What we've also seen, especially in early days, manufacturers using line by line the entire MDR, they put it in an Excel sheet, then you get about 2,000 lines. And they started to say, well, what do we have? What do we need to change? Who needs to do that? Who needs to work together with someone else? And basically the entire pack got stuck because that is so complex. So at a certain moment, it is better to say, well, for toxicity, which department is responsible, which person is responsible. And if that person or department needs someone else, they are in charge to organize it, rather than trying to fix everything from a top level view, because that will be too complex. What people have to remember in practice, what works well is that people ask you, if a colleague asks you to support from your perspective what they're doing, to let go of barriers and just step in and help your colleagues, because that is much smoother than trying to formalize it with all kinds of meetings and so on.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point, Gert. So, yes, exhaustive, but also critically done, and done in a way that you know what it is that you need to focus on, and you're not basically putting the entire guideline documentation into your files. Yeah. All right, coming to one of our favorite topics of software as medical device. So, are there any special considerations for GSPRs when it comes to these devices?
So there's actually only a few things that I mentioned before. If you look at software, of course, all of the other GSPRs are applicable, so also warnings and so on the labeling. On the other hand, for software, there's quite a few things that you can tick as not applicable because it's not physically a device. What we see sometimes is it's that it's difficult for notified bodies to understand the validations of software because they are linked to validation of equipment that is being controlled or where there's a link to the hardware, and that is part of the validation. So in that sense, make sure that even if it's combined, if it's a system approach that you've validated, that sufficiently clear evidence on the software part is provided into your technical documentation. Then in terms of the GSPR itself, maybe logical elements, but pretty black and white. Of course, the elements should be repeatable, reliable in their performance. So there should not be, and that is difficult for example, for artificial intelligence-based devices. At this moment, basically, the legislation says it has to be frozen because it cannot continue to learn. Well, it can continue to learn, but then you have to evaluate and release the improved version. Because otherwise it is not repeatable because it tends to improve itself. So that's a black and white thing that is limiting a little bit the artificial intelligence progress. Where we see most deficiencies from notified bodies at this moment is the topic on single fold reduction, so single fold risks as far as possible. They have a lot of concerns in that area. Um, Similar to where you have embedded software, I would say there's much more requirements on watchdogs again, also to make sure that there's a second way to prevent disaster. And so then for the software itself, single fault in that sense. Information security, we mentioned that before in the broader sense. There are requirements to be specific about what computing platform are used, including mobile computing platforms. We see some manufacturers struggle with that. So yes, your device is developed and validated on laptops and other computers, but in practice it could also be used, or some modules could be used on the doctor's mobiles, or they create something themselves. That sometimes leads to off-label use or potentially off-label use as well. And then, of course, but that's more the detail of what you have to write down, where you need to write the requirements for hardware, for the IT networks, for IT security measures that need to be taken. And this is not just a general piece of advice, as it is in the GSPRs. You will need to also have demonstrated that following your advice, that is safe and good enough to have effective performance of the devices moving forward.
Interesting. And I think this is very important because now we are going to see more surge in SAMDs in the market. Especially, I always say that when we are discussing software, that especially in growth markets like India, we have a lot of startups where young manufacturers are coming in with these kind of devices and they are trying to digitize healthcare. And I think overall, every manufacturer wants to put their market in the globe, put their devices in the global market as well. And in terms of these requirements and the regulations, I think they are going to have to do a lot more work. And especially, I like the example that you use for artificial intelligence devices because these are self-training algorithms and they are going to um, grow better with each iteration of the process. And yeah, it will be quite challenging to have to conform to these requirements when you have some algorithms that are running on iterative processes and improving with every cycle. So that's interesting, the perspective that you presented. Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing to consider in that case, Anushree, is that the U.S. FDA is writing guidance on that that might be more flexible than the European requirements at this moment. So it could well be that manufacturers could basically utilize the guidance and the acceptance by the US FDA in the system to collect data and then stepwise bring the improvements from their devices that they have generated in the US also into the notified body review, therefore on the CE mark products.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Thank you. All right. Usability studies. Okay, we talk about usability studies that manufacturers conduct to see how well the device is being used by the end users based on the instructions that are provided in the labeling, and overall how is the performance and safety from the perspective of the users themselves. So, how does that picture in the whole GSPR discussion?
So you have to be a little bit careful to analyze and see where this joins in. And in the past, we have seen some manufacturers basically abuse usability studies by calling them clinical studies. And that, of course, is no longer applicable. We see more and more usability studies, usability engineering, not only as part of active devices, as it was initially when the standards came in place, but now also for non-active devices. More and more expectations, but you have to find where they are. And so we talked about one of the usability studies already that is required, and that is if you have laypersons utilizing the devices. And that's a GSPR 22, where you would have to do a specific usability study on laypersons understanding the skills and language requirements that these laypersons and so on have. Second part where we find reference to the usability studies is in the earlier sections of the GSPRs, which is on the risk management versus the clinical benefit. And so especially if you focus on the GSPR 5, that focuses on the use error. So you can look at it in a broader perspective. So any risk that is relating to the user, as well as the positive element. So how can we demonstrate that it's okay? So it's okay to use some of that, and you can say, well, that is close to getting clinical benefit. No, it is. Well, if you present it as positive evidence in light of your risk mitigation and so on, you might use it that way. But basically, it is in relation to GSPR 22, as said, and GSPR 5 on use error. A more positive approach would say, well, but we have intentions, we have claims, we say how you should use it, and then it performs as we intended it. And so you can also say, well, usability studies are to some extent the validation that our anticipations have been right, that the user can use it correctly and so on. Right? So how you frame it can be more positive or more towards the risk management, but in a positive way. But that's basically where I would say the key link to the GSPRs lies.
Yes, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think overall, the risks that are encountered, that are seen in these usability studies, as long as the manufacturers are able to show that in their use FMEA also, that they are able to mitigate the risk as much as possible, and whatever is not mitigated, as in whatever is residual, if they are able to present that in an upfront manner in their device documents to the users, like you said, in layman also. And I think even the SSCP will come into this, where SSCP, I know it's going to have this section in layman language, which is going to tell the users not just not how the device is used, but also overall technical aspects of the device in terms of its effect and the therapeutic purpose of it. I think all that together is probably going to figure into this a lot. So, as we always say, that all sorts of documentation around the work that they are doing in different areas of the regulatory control and the quality part as well is going to converge to make sure that a device is finally shown to have GSPR adherence. All right.
Exactly.
Okay, I think the last couple of questions that we have. This one we've already touched upon a little bit when we have spoken about how manufacturers are going to transition into GSPRs. So, just very quickly, at what stage of device development should manufacturers start to address GSPRs, and how will this get affected during a design change process?
So in that sense, I think the short answer is as soon as possible. But in terms of the processes in the ISO 13485 standard, for instance, as soon as you really formalize your design input. So you are looking at material choices, interaction with other devices, the surrounding, the user. How do you envisage your product to be designed? That's basically where you have to start, because that's where you can make the key decisions what to do and what not to do. From there, it follows the risk management, and I would say with every design process gate, you have to update your draft GSPR checklist to make sure you're not forgetting anything or you're making key mistakes. As for then its life cycle, much more, and we talked already a little bit about post-market surveillance elements. That continues, of course, also for the GSPR. So if there will be design changes, and a core element is to make sure that also GSPRs are updated as soon as you start thinking about a design change, so that you can see the impact it will have, and from there your validation plan will follow.
Right. And I think at every point, we have to remember that manufacturers are performing risk analysis throughout their design process. So, like you said, that from the time you start your design inputs, that's when you're going to start thinking about how it's going to translate in terms of the risks that are posed by this device. So from that stage itself, you're going to start thinking about GSPRs and start building the checklist and start writing how exactly is your device functioning and how it is mitigating the risk and how it's going to conform finally to the associated GSPR.
True, true.
Great. And finally, from a clinical evaluation standpoint, and I asked this as a medical writer myself, generally when we have a development of clinical evaluation reports, so far when we were focusing on essential requirements, we were talking about essential requirements 1, 3, and 6, which were the primary areas that relate to the clinical evaluation of a device. Now, when we talk about GSPR, and for our listeners who are medical writers working on these kind of reports, or do they have to throw light on multiple GSPRs when they're talking about clinical evaluation, or how's that going to be?
Yeah, so I would start by saying that this typically is done from a more holistic approach, where we start from the claims and intended user, and so on as the basis for what you're writing down. Link that back to the risk, the benefit per claim, per hazard, and so on. That should be the overall goal, to make sure that the risk benefit is substantiated throughout the documentation. But if you want to be a little bit more specific, which GSPRs do now really talk about clinical evaluation, I would say there's a few. One is the starting point, and it's good that it is one because they're in a logical order. The most important one is called one. So Annex 1.1 is actually what you have to do: demonstrate safety, performance, and effectiveness. And so that of course links into the essence of the clinical evaluation. Then GSPR 6 focuses on selection of adverse effects. So that should be added as well. A little bit, and we talked a little bit about transportation before packaging for the microbiology part, but also in terms of clinical, it is relevant and mentioned in GSPR 7. that transporting and packaging should be considered. It also means that the clinical evaluation has to be done with material that has been packaged and transported in a similar way, ideally, as the final products that you will bring to the market. If not, you will have to justify why you have separate testing on that. And then, of course, the final, so in balance with GSPR 1, we have GSPR 8. That is, as we had before, the benefit risks should be evaluated and scored, and hopefully with a positive result. But what's important to realize there is that the law, and this is one of the things that becomes less difficult, one of the few, it is under normal conditions of use. So we talked a little bit about off-label use. That should not be considered here. It is, as you indicated it, for normal conditions of use, it should be good enough and it should work. GSPR 8. So in conclusion, 1, 6, 7, and 8 would be what I would refer to in the GSPR checklist to clinical.
Thank you, Gert. That helps our listeners also understand what exactly to focus on. I have one question. I was waiting to get to this clinical evaluation part to ask this. When you started out talking about GSPRs and ERs, you said that now we are not just looking at safety performance, there's also this thing called as effectiveness. So when we talk about effectiveness, my understanding is we are trying to look at the clinical benefits that a patient is going to have. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the difficulty is that the word effective is not defined in our legislation. So we can assume that it is at least what we had before, that is the clinical performance and clinical benefits, as we talk about benefits in that sense. And so in that sense, it means that a manufacturer has to claim that there is a positive clinical benefit. Otherwise, you cannot meet the final GSPR checklist. And that's the least that effectiveness should bring. It's not efficacy, which is used in pharmaceutical legislation, because that determines, well, how effective is it? So in so many patients, 98% would have a benefit that is so and so precise. That is not what we're looking for with this wording. It is something vague in between. And I guess that also in time, we will start to understand how notified bodies interpret this. I think it will start with clinical benefit and clinical performance being demonstrated. And over time, and that goes into the common specifications that we discussed in relation to standards, there might be in time common specifications that would identify what the minimum proven effectiveness of a particular group of products would be. So heart valves should help so many percentage of patients for a period of time that's also specified. Still, it doesn't go into efficacy in detail, but it moves in time into that direction. And I guess that has been the purpose of putting undefined word in GSPR 1, because then the interpretation can slowly move in time. And that's part of the regulation. I guess that's what we see. The continuous improvement, and we see that in the PMS, in the PMCF, in the documentation, but then also in words like this. The continuous improvement that we know from ISO 9000 and from some of our quality management systems 13485 is now moving into the regulatory requirement. And this word is one example of it, because it will continue to be a slowly moving target.
Right. Okay. I asked this because we work with a lot of such devices, which are mainly accessory in nature, and it becomes quite challenging to talk about the clinical benefits because they are serving a purpose that makes the primary device achieve its therapeutic purpose. So I was trying to think from that perspective, like how are we going to bring in that whole clinical benefit, clinical evaluation perspective into these devices. But like you said, that this is something that's going to evolve with time. We're going to be able to see how the industry is interpreting effectiveness also, and probably that's going to help manufacturers with time to do a better analysis also.
I would agree with that, and I would think that for accessories, it's easier in that sense. because basically the accessory you should compare, well, how should we implant a product without the accessories, right? So the effectiveness of getting the product in its place, or getting the main product to function, is clearly supporting effectiveness. um, some notified bodies have started to say, but that's only relevant if then the core medical device is effective as well. And so then we have to distinguish, if you put the accessory in the same technical documentation, yes, they are linked. If you only write separate documents for the accessory, then you can make the distinction and say, well, for the accessory, the endpoint basically of my clinical evaluation, if it helped get the core product in place, or if it helps enough to keep a motor of equipment running, or whatever its function is, then your endpoint is very simple, a physical means, or an endpoint in time after the surgical procedure, and then effectiveness should be rated on that.
Right, exactly. Okay, great. This was great. You've answered all our questions perfectly. And just checking in, good. Any final words before we close this session?
No, so it's been a pleasure to work with you, and it's been a pleasure to provide some insight. I guess the core message is to understand what the legislation is driving at. Um, and so what is the intention of the law? You will find that in the executive summary, 8 points, 9 points that the European Commission shared on our website. So improving patient safety, having more visibility and transparency. With that in mind, just get going, and just don't wait until your perfect gap assessment, but try to collect all the evidence you have, fix the key gaps in your GSPRs, and then start talking to your notified body, because the to get them on board and get quotes and get started from the review can take up to 9 months at this moment. So when you have fixed your key gaps, don't forget to call them in time to get started. And with that, I wish you all good luck in preparing excellent technical documentation.
Thank you, Gert. Those were a bunch of fantastic advice and pointers from you. And how lucky are we to get it right from the expert who's so well versed with the medical devices regulatory space. And everything that you said today, I'm sure is going to benefit our listeners a lot who are still trying to understand the nuances of different documents, guidance documents, and everything that the MDR has brought in right now. So thanks once again for being a part of the show. And I'm very excited to have this released to our audience also, who are going to love this session. So look forward to talking to you again. And thanks, everybody. This was all that we had for today. I'll see you in the next episode of Tea Time Talks with MDRP.